Calliope's Tale by FalcomReynolds. Chapter 10. Voice of the Sea. Ianthe didn't care about blood relations, Calliope mused, but it seemed the gods did, because they wouldn't speak to her. She hated disappointing Ianthe. She did, and she could tell the first mate was disappointed, even though she pretended not to be. But when Calliope repeated the prayers and tried to channel the goddesses of the sea, they didn't come to her. Calliope was almost envious of the way Ianthe could bring one of them through between one breath and the next, close her eyes and open them, and where before they were deep brown, they would become black as the depths of the ocean or white as the fire of lightning, and Calliope could see the crackle of magic running through her veins and over her skin, see the ghostly impression of the goddess she channeled swirling around her body like a veil in water. But they wouldn't come to her. She saw them, and yes, when Ianthe held them, they could see her too, but they never came to her. She called them, ordered, begged, pleaded, but even when they listened to her, they never responded but for once, when Athu shook her head before slipping away from Ianthe into the deep ocean before the ship. "They won't come to me," Calliope told Ianthe again, after failing for what felt like the 100th time to bring Kalari to her. No, don't be like that. It's because I'm not your blood." "But I should be able to teach you," Ianthe murmured, shaking her head. It's not you," Calliope interrupted with a sigh. "I think it's because I already have my own magic. If I had yours too, wouldn't that be ridiculous? It'd be silly. Nobody's allowed to have that much." Ianthe paused, considering this. "I suppose you're right," she said, in the tone of voice that meant she wasn't quite convinced. There was something else in her eyes, too. A flash of knowledge Calliope wasn't privy to, but it passed in a moment. Calliope shrugged. "It's fine, really," she said, resolving to find out what hid behind Ianthe's mind in the future. Not now. She just shut down, and Calliope didn't want that. "I don't mind," she hummed. "My own power is enough for me." "Speaking of that," Ianthe said, "what do you mean?" "What do I mean by what?" "Your own power." Time for another demonstration. Calliope turned and hummed a few notes to herself, constructing a melody, then sang them out carefully. The water before her shivered and hissed, the top layer turning to steam and vanishing into the sky. Ianthe blinked, startled. Calliope beat her tail once and turned back, grinning. "I can do a whole lot more than that," she said. "But that's a little bit of it." "A lot more?" Ianthe said, raising one eyebrow. "Such as?" "I don't know. Lots of things, probably. Some of them very destructive indeed. I don't know. I haven't had a chance to really test it out." "I'm not certain that we should want one." Calliope leaned back and floated on the surface of the water, grinning. "Yes, but wouldn't it be interesting to try?" It took far too long for Calliope to learn the name of her archenemy. "That's a bit of a strong term, don't you think?" Miquello said, laying on his back in the lifeboat next to the midnight sun while Calliope floated in the water. She shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "He deserves it." Alizarin. That was the name of the man who had scared Ianthe so badly she channeled two gods at once, multiple times, just to get away from him. The name of the man that had frightened her enough that when Miquello had mentioned his name once, she'd gone silent and stiff. The name of the vile person who had done something, or threatened to do something, terrible enough that when Calliope cornered Ianthe to ask about it, the first mate had snapped at her, telling her she shouldn't ask if she wanted to keep herself and the rest of the crew safe, and to never mention him again unless it was necessary. Miquello was silent for a second. The waves lapped around the lifeboat as Calliope leaned on the edge of it, chin on her hands. "How much do you know about him?" Miquello finally asked. "Nothing. I know his name because someone said it, and I know he's evil." "Well, that's a start," Miquello sighed, shaking his head. "Ianthe will kill me, but I may as well tell you what's going on, You'll find out on your own anyway if I don't. Story time. Calliope had to stop herself from smiling. Alizarin was Leonthe's captain on the last ship she sailed on, Mikolo explained. She was part of the crew of the Heretic, the first mate, actually. And while she was on board, Alizarin started to use soul magic. Soul magic? It's capturing the soul of something that has died and using it for your own purpose after sealing it in the world. Or something. He frowned, shaking his head. I don't know the specifics of it, probably because I've never used it. Because I can't, and I don't want to. But whatever they are, you can do it to creatures or people. And Alizarin does it to people. Well, that sounds bad. Aye, that's 'cause it is. He learned how to take the souls of other gifted people, not just ordinary folk. He would have done it to Ianthe, killed her and stolen her soul, if he could have. But wasn't she the first mate? Yes. He would kill his own first mate? From what I hear, he's done it several times now. Calliope didn't know much about the workings of other ships, but if Mikolo had done that, she would have killed him instantly, even if the first mate wasn't Ianthe. How is he getting away with this? She finally said, disgusted. Who's going to combat him? His ship sails faster than any other, and if you die in battle with him, he'll steal and enslave your soul. No one wants to risk that. But someone should stop him. No one has yet. Calliope made up her mind. I'll stop him. Let's not jump the gun here, Mikolo responded, raising his head to look over at her, expression caught between frightened and dubious. Oh, why not? Someone needs to kill him. It might as well be me. Mikolo opened his mouth and shut it again. I've fought monsters before, Calliope said with a shrug. I can do it again. This is different, Mikolo tried desperately. He's not a serpent, something you can simply grab onto and rip apart. He's got magic. So do I. Mikolo sputtered. He's clever, and he'll use every trick he can against you. Calliope smiled. This was what she wanted to hear. Mikolo giving her tips on how to fight. His voice sounded like he wanted her to give it up, but the words said he wanted her to win. Excellent, she said. Tell me more. Ianthe did not control all storms. Some were too great for her to alter, and some the goddess did not want her to alter. Calliope felt one a few miles off to the northwest at the same time as the lookouts in the crow's nest spotted it. She watched as Ianthe and Mikolo headed to the edge of the rail and followed them so she could hear their conversation. That's not mine, Ianthe said, staring at it. I think we would know if it was, Mikolo answered. We can't be caught in that. The crew swarmed over the rigging, turning the sails to catch the wind coming off the front. They could get away from this, past a few small islands to a safe cove, but they needed to act fast, and it was a direct diversion off course. That was fine. It was better to take a detour than being caught in a storm they didn't need to fight with. Calliope couldn't help with the sails, but she could scout the territory ahead, searching for other ships or signs of inhabitants, like serpents or other marids. The last thing the Midnight Sun needed was to encounter another unexpected sea serpent while trying to escape the storm. She took off southeast, pressing her arms against her sides, racing through the water. She did not find any sea creatures, but she did find a crown fleet. The second she saw their hulls from below, she backfinned to a halt and surfaced, trying to count, checking the sails to confirm her suspicions. There were at least 12 ships, the sails white with the golden symbol, all between the Midnight Sun and the safety of the islands. This was going to be trouble. Calliope turned, speeding back to the Midnight Sun. They were already feeling the storm front batter at the sails, and were desperately heading towards the crown ships. She surfaced and waved her arms until someone came over to the side. We can't go that way, she called up, blinking salt water out of her eyes. It's too dangerous. Why? Said the crewman. It was Ekash, a young, wiry-framed man with soft black eyes. "There's a crown fleet blocking access to the islands." His eyes widened, and he pulled back from the rail to look over the deck before looking back down. "We can't change course. We'll be caught in the storm." "We can't keep course. We'll be caught by the fleet." Ekash shook his head desperately and disappeared from the rail. Moments later, Mikulo appeared. "A crown fleet?" he questioned. "Are you certain?" "Yes." "How many?" "I said a fleet, didn't I? At least 12, maybe more." He swore profusely. "We're going to have to get past them somehow." Thunder cracked overhead. Calliope saw the lightning arc from one black cloud to the next. She swallowed nervously, feeling the swell grow rougher. "Are you sure we can't manage the storm?" she asked, but she already knew the answer. Mikulo shook his head. Ianthe? Can you deal with this storm?" Calliope didn't hear Ianthe's response, but she did see Mikulo's expression fall and heard him swear again. He tried to say something, but the wind whipping by stole his words. The wind whipping by. Calliope narrowed her eyes, thinking, and glancing to the southeast. Maybe. "Let me up," she yelled, looking back to Mikulo. "What?" "Let me up! Quickly, quickly!" She beckoned. "Get me on board. I can help." It had been quite some time since she had been brought on board. A few crew members stopped working on the sails and lowered a lifeboat for her. She hauled herself in and winced as she felt the full effect of gravity pin her body to the boat. Being out of the water was awful. But she didn't have a choice, and she could help right now. "Hurry!" she called, watching the crew pull her up. "Come on, come on!" The sails billowed, carrying the ship further. "Keep her going," Calliope said to Mikulo as the boat reached the rail. "I can deal with the fleet." "I beg your pardon?" "I need to get to the front of the ship." Calliope addressed Aisha, who had been one of the crew who pulled her up. "Quickly!" Aisha nodded once and reached down, picking Calliope's torso up and hefting her over one shoulder. Her tail dragged onto the ground. 2 crew behind her heaved it up and followed. This was a little bit demeaning, but there was no other way to get to the front, unless she wanted to crawl. The crew brought her to the prow. "Now what?" Aisha called over the wind. "Set me down!" Once she was down, she dragged herself up and over to the front railing and out onto the bowsprit, which was much smaller than she had hoped. But it was strong and could hold her weight. She wrapped her tail around it and held on tightly with both hands, inching out in front of the ship. "What are you doing?" she heard Ianthe yell from somewhere behind her, but she ignored her. "We've seen your magic," she thought, narrowing her eyes at the crown ships appearing on the horizon. "And now we'll see some of mine." She raised the front of her body up as far as she could manage, took as deep a breath as she could manage, and began to sing. Ianthe dealt with creating and controlling. Calliope could bend what was already there, convincing things to be different, stop minds from thinking. She wove a tune into the wind. Not the sound she used to stun fish before catching them, but a nearly wordless chain of notes that ensnared, enraptured, enchanted. Behind her, she heard the crew's work falter. She glanced back once and saw Ianthe staring at her for a moment, and felt a brief stab of fear in her heart. Would she accidentally ensorcel her own ship's crew? No. Ianthe nodded to her, expression caught between fierce determination and even fiercer pride, and turned away. The crew, used to hearing Calliope's voice, shook their heads free of her song and kept the ship's sails full. Calliope turned back to the southeast and sent her words away on the wind. She could almost see the shimmer of her magic in the air, caught like a fishing net in a current, whipping away towards the Crown Fleet. She saw that magic alight on those ships, and as the midnight sun drew closer, the fleet remained perfectly still, unmoving, not even preparing themselves for the oncoming storm. The crews of the crown ships had been struck dumb. They were standing, completely still, heads cocked to the side, ears filled with song. Calliope could see them staring with glassy eyes at the midnight sun as she slipped past them towards the islands, and the sun's crew murmured uneasily amongst themselves to see the sailors so lost. She did not falter. None of the crown ships moved to stop them. One of them had cannons half loaded. They'd probably seen the midnight sun coming. But the cannoneers now stood idle, the cannonballs laying on the deck where they'd slipped out of their hands. "Stay there," Calliope sang to the crowned sailors. "Stay here, and dream of a ship, and dream of a merit who sang to you, and dream of clear skies, and do not listen to the sound of thunder. It is a lie, a terrible lie, told to you by a distant goddess. Listen to me. Stay here. Dream." The sun made it through. Calliope could hear the storm closing in and watched as the sun glided around the corner of the islands and made her careful way to the channels. The wind wouldn't carry Calliope's voice anymore. She stopped singing and braced herself on the bowsprit, head spinning. She shook her hair out of her face, trying to keep her vision straight. The midnight sun headed around the southeastern side of the island ring and dropped anchor in a sheltered cove. The storm came. Calliope saw it drop gray curtains of rain down onto the Crown Fleet. She watched it obscure the jungle of the islands and come racing across the water's surface to drench the midnight sun. She dropped off the bowsprit into the water when it did and darted over to the shallow cave in the rocky walls of the lagoon, out of the rain. It roared on the cliffs, pounded on the surface of the sea. No one pursued them.